Hi everyone. We're going to take a look at the second game in Bobby Fischer's book, My 60 Memorable Games. This one was played against Bent Larsen in 1958. And Bent Larsen was born 8 years before Fischer in 1935. And he was a Danish chess grandmaster and author, known for his imaginative and unorthodox style of play. And he was the first Western player to pose a serious challenge to the Soviet Union's dominance in chess. He's considered to be the strongest player born in Denmark and the strongest from Scandinavia until the emergence of Magnus Carlsen. So, as I said, this game took place in 1958, and it was at the Interzonal tournament that year. And there were 21 players in that tournament, and the top 6 would qualify to go on to the candidates tournament in 1959. Well, Fischer got 6th place at the Interzonal, and he qualified. He went to the candidates tournament, where he finished 6th place again out of 8 players. And Mikhail Tal won that candidates tournament, which won him the right to challenge Botvinnik for the World Championship in 1960, and Tal did win the World Championship that year. All right, so let's have a look at the game. Fischer had the white pieces, and they played a Sicilian defense. In particular, they played a dragon variation characterized by this move G6. Now, Fischer had some disparaging things to say about this dragon variation in the book. He claims that it's not a good way to play the Sicilian, and it's well known that the Yugoslav attack, which he utilizes in this game, is too strong of a weapon for black to handle. And he claims that Larsen is one of the last people left to be playing the Yugoslav. Well, I think the dragon has actually survived the test of time, and people still do play it today. And there are defensive resources available to black. Okay, so Fischer plays bishop to e3, and that signals the Yugoslav attack. So let me mention what that is. So white's intention here is to play queen to d2. So he's developing his queen side first because he wants to castle on that side of the board. Now, inevitably, black will end up castling on the king side. So with the opposite wing castling, each player will be launching a pawn storm against the enemy king. In particular, white wants to attack down the h file. He wants to pry open that h file and use his h1 rook to attack the black king. Okay, so here Fischer points out a well-known trap that some beginners fall into. He says black cannot play knight to g4 to try to disturb the placement of that bishop, because bishop to b5 check wins material. For example, if black blocks with the knight, then white takes it, and then after recapturing, white gets a pawn and will win the exchange here. And if black blocks the check by putting one of his minor pieces on d7, even the bishop, then white can take the knight because the bishop is pinned. So either way, black loses material. So black can't play knight to g4, so he completes the fianchetto, and now white plays f3, and this move prepares queen to d2, because if white plays queen to d2 first, then black can play knight to g4 and disturb the placement of that bishop, because there's no more queen attacking that knight, and so bishop to b5 check doesn't win material. So to prepare that move, queen to d2, white first plays f3 to secure the bishop on e3. And black castles, queen to d2, knight c6. And now, at the time of this game in 1958, Fischer says the old way of playing was long castles in this position, and mentions it was a recent refinement to play the move bishop c4, which is what happens in this game. And the purpose of playing bishop to c4 first is to prevent black from getting a freeing pawn break with d5. Okay, so black exchanges knights and then plays bishop to e6, and we're still following pretty much mainline theory in the dragon here. Okay, white drops the bishop back so it's protected by the pawns, and then queen a5 connects the rooks, develops the queen, and now finally white plays long castles. So black pushes his pawn to b5. He wants to get these pawns moving, and white takes time to secure his king. It's just a general move you see in the dragon or a lot of Sicilians where white is castled queenside. It's just a safer square for the king, which can come under fire down the c file or down this dark diagonal, and the king's also protecting the a2 square. Okay, b4, attacking the knight, and the knight centralizes itself, and black has to choose which piece to take that knight with, because the knight is threatening the pawn on e7, and he's also threatening to break up the pawn structure by capturing on f6. So black needs to take that knight, and Larsen takes it with the bishop, and there's a line given in the book where if black had taken it with the knight, then white would exchange bishops on g7 and play e takes d5, the bishop would fall back, and then a rook would come to the e file. And so here Fischer says in this variation he would have abandoned the idea of attacking on the king side and instead just played for pressure down the e file. So notice that pawn is under pressure and black can't advance it because white would capture here, and then after recapturing white would win the pawn on the d file. Okay, so that pressure is hard to meet. All right, so Larsen didn't capture with the knight, though. He captures with the bishop, and Fischer takes back with his bishop. And now Larsen plays rook a c8, and I think Fischer criticizes him for not taking the bishop on d5. And after the game, Larsen remarked that the reason he played his rook to c8 is because he wanted to play for a win. And he claims that he had a forced draw if he had taken the bishop. So let's take a look at that. If he had taken the bishop, then white can exchange here on g7. There's a Zwischenzug here, a check, and then b takes c3, rook a b8, okay, taking the pawn, taking with the queen, calling check, exchanging queens, dropping the bishop back to defend, but the other rook attacks the pinned bishop, and black will win the bishop back. And that looks very drawish to me. The engine agrees. It's about equal. So I think that would have been a safer way for black to play. Fischer mentions he did have another option, though, after knight takes the bishop. He could have taken back with the pawn and not exchanged on g7. And then after queen takes pawn, Fischer had intended queen takes b4, and he says he would have kept playing the game and it would have had a little more life to it than that other line. All right, but anyway, Larsen does play his rook from a to c8, and that gives Fischer the chance to save his bishop. And he says he's not going to give Larsen another chance to take it. And that bishop plays a good defensive role here, and it still will be an offensive attacking piece as well. Okay, now black plays rook to c7 with two purposes. One is to double the rooks on the c file, but also he needs to secure this pawn on a7 because he wants to play queen to b5 and get it out of the way of the a pawn so he can march that a pawn forward, but he first has to protect the pawn so white doesn't play bishop takes a7. Okay, now finally Fischer puts his h pawn into action and starts attacking the black king. And he felt very confident at this point. He said he has won positions analogous to this dozens of times in offhand games. And he says it's always the same. You pry open the h file, you sack, and you mate. It's a kind of a famous quote by Fischer. And he had a lot of success, and I think he was quite confident in this attack. Okay, so here black gets on with his counterplay, moves his queen out of the way of the a-pawn, and Fischer gives reams of analysis to explain why playing h5 doesn't really help black's cause, doesn't stop white's attack after the move g4, and we won't go through all of that analysis. Okay, so black plays queen b5, and then h5 to pry open the h-file. Okay, black doubles rooks, and h takes g6, h takes g6, g4, and Fischer says he has to be careful here and play correctly. For example, he didn't want to be tempted by bishop taking the knight, because after bishop takes bishop, queen to h6 check. It looks like white is threatening an attack here with queen to h7 check and then taking on f7 because his bishop is pointed at that square. But black would have everything under control after e6, blunting the effect of that bishop. And then white really has nothing in the position. So he doesn't take the knight. He plays g4, going for g5 to dislodge the knight. And then a5, the counterplay comes on the queen side, g5, and the knight goes to h5 to block the h-file. But here's a typical exchange sacrifice that you often see in this Yugoslav attack. Just take the knight, and then you're going to open a lot of lines to the black king here. Okay, Fischer said that if black, instead of taking back the rook, if he had taken on d4 first, then white would have played queen takes d4, and then after taking the rook, he would have played g6, and he says that white is still winning in this line as well if black had done that, had delayed the recapture by exchanging bishops first. And he gives a lot of analysis to support his conclusion. But when I checked it with the engine, I found out that he was actually wrong. White's not winning in this line at all, which indicates that he never really was winning in the attack until a few moves later when Larsen starts to go wrong. But at this point, he never really was winning. And the miraculous move that the engine gives here that saves black is rook to c4. Remember, black's up in exchange, so he can give an exchange back to blunt the attack. This blocks the bishop here. And the engine gives the line g takes f7 check, king takes f7. E5 would be a move to give some room for the queen to come over to f4 maybe. And then black can attack the bishop, and then check, king comes up, bishop takes rook with check, queen recaptures, check from h6, king goes back, and now there's a pin on this pawn, and queen to h7 defends the c2 point against a mate. And then the rook comes to c6 and defends that pinned pawn. It was attacked twice, and now it's defended twice. And everything's under control here, and the engine says it's 0.0. So chess is hard, okay? There's a lot of moves to consider. It's not so simple. Even a future world champion didn't consider all the moves in the position. He missed this move, rook to c4. Okay, anyway, in the game, back to the game, black takes the rook back right away, and then g6 comes, trying to open more lines to the king. There's pressure on f7 now. e5 attacks the bishop, but then Fischer takes on f7 with check, king to f8, bishop falls back, d5, so that blocks the diagonal from the light square bishop, so black is threatening to take the pawn, and white takes the pawn on d5, and then black takes on f7. Okay, Fischer pushes the passed pawn and attacks the rook on f7. The rook saves itself, but then bishop to g5, and that rook's in a lot of trouble, and the black king is looking quite a bit worse than the white king in this position. Black tried queen b7, then white took the rook, black took back, d7 attacking the rook, rook to d8. And here Fischer plays queen to d6 check, and black resigned. And the reason black resigned is because he has two moves in the position, both of which lose. If he had blocked the check with the bishop, then white had this really nice checkmate, queen to h6, nice checkmate with crossing diagonals here, and the pawn has that square covered. And otherwise the king would have had to run to g7, but that allows the white rook to get into the attack, and then white would win the bishop, and the engine announces that there's a mate in 4 in the position. So that's why black resigned. I'll point out that Fischer criticizes himself in the book for not seeing the mate in 3 in the position. So there was a simpler win with queen to h6 check. And there's two moves here for black. If he had blocked with the bishop, then again there's a mate in 1, this time using parallel diagonals, and the pawn still has that square covered. And if the king had run, it would have to go to e7, but then queen to h7 check, and there's a mate on the next move. Either the king goes back to f8 and gets mated, or the bishop blocks and he gets mated anyway. Okay, so excellent game by the young 15-year-old Fischer in the 1958 Interzonal against Bent Larsen. All right, thanks for watching.